Welcome into this week's edition of the Climate Friday newsletter. Meteorologist John Birchfield here. It's been an active month of July, hasn't it, with numerous rain and thunderstorm chances. And this week was no different as we saw severe weather and across much of the Midwest and Great Lakes region, a number of tornado touchdowns. So we're going to break down severe weather and what role climate change may be playing in this and recap the weather that we saw over the last week. Good to have you with us. You can be sure to subscribe at WTOL.com/email for new content each and every Friday. And you can find us on YouTube, online, and on WTOL 11+ on all those platforms. Let's get into the science and break down severe weather and the role that climate change may be playing on the prevalence of not only severe weather, but also tornado touchdowns and a number of other types of weather phenomena. So let's recap the weather that we experienced this week, both locally and across much of the Great Lakes and the Midwest region. From Wednesday evening, 12 preliminary tornadoes were reported, and that'll get filtered and fine-tuned as the National Weather Service performs storm surveys. Some of those surveys are still ongoing and are being taken by a number of different offices, including the Chicago National Weather Service, Detroit, as well as the Northern Indiana one. However, we are seeing damage signs that indicate EF1, if not stronger tornado damage. As far as how wind speeds that would correlate to, that represents over 100 miles an hour, with some of the strongest tornadoes likely achieving 110 as far as those peak wind speeds. In addition to the tornado reports, a lot of heavy rain across central and northern Michigan and back towards northern Illinois. That was the epicenter of severe weather, where a number of tornadoes touched down. Across the entire lower Great Lakes region, 12 preliminary tornado reports, many of those slowly but surely being confirmed. The National Weather Service near Chicago has confirmed at least 7 tornado touchdowns, and all of those occurred in several storm cells, mainly to the west and northwest of Chicago and all the way up towards the state line of Illinois and Wisconsin, where those twisters touched down again Wednesday evening, several of which did damage, and EF1 damage has been represented. What about our weather here? Well, we did see some of those cross over Lake Michigan and make their way into parts of southwest Michigan, and we saw some funnel cloud reports there to the north of Porter, Michigan, and also closer to Sturgis. Another funnel cloud was reported. There actually was confirmation of a tornado touchdown. This was just to the west of Hillsdale, about 30 miles west of Hillsdale. Now, when we saw the damage come in, it was indicative of, hey, this may be a tornado, and it was indeed confirmed near Colon, Michigan. Multiple barns were damaged. There was metal debris that was lofted, and it's likely that this tornado touched down almost directly over top of a warehouse or a storage facility, hence a lot of that structural damage. In Colon, Michigan, an EF1 tornado was confirmed, 90-mile-an-hour wind speeds on the lower end of that EF1 spectrum. A little too close for comfort with this tornado touching down just about 30 miles to the west of Hillsdale, Michigan, and it did prompt a tornado warning. Here's a radar loop of Wednesday evening showing you those severe thunderstorms originating in Illinois and crossing over Lake Michigan. They did lose a little bit of steam as they entered Hillsdale and Lenawee counties, but due to the presence of a low-pressure storm system spinning away in that counterclockwise motion, we saw a lot of turning in the atmosphere with all of these storms. You'll notice that overall weakening trend eventually as the night went on. Those thunderstorms weakened as they moved into our southeastern Michigan counties. So what role is climate change playing in severe weather and tornado touchdowns as well? Well, it's no secret that we're seeing warmer temperatures. The world is getting warmer, both the land and the sea, and that causes more evaporation and fuel for storms. The warmer the thermometers get, the more moisture gets pulled up into the atmosphere, and evaporation eventually leads to precipitation. Heavy rain is one of the biggest impacts out of that, but with all of that rising moist air in the atmosphere, we're also seeing fuel for thunderstorms that is leading to more strong to severe storms. What about the spinning or the turning in the atmosphere? One of the parameters or ingredients that we use to quantify that is called wind shear, and when you ever hear us use that on air, that represents that spinning or rotational movement in the atmosphere. Now, the changes due to climate change are still somewhat unclear regarding that, and wind shear is largely dependent on the type of storm system that moves on through. As we saw Wednesday, having a low pressure that moves directly over Lake Michigan, that could provide the ingredients for a good amount of wind shear in the atmosphere. The link to climate change, not quite as clear-cut as is the link to greater evaporation variation due to those warmer temperatures. However, we do have data that the fuel or the ingredients for those severe thunderstorms is growing more intense. This map shows you the annual thunderstorm potential, and there's a lot of different variables that go into this, but one of them that is the most clear-cut due to climate change is simply the warmer temperatures. The purple color across the eastern half of the United States shows you an increase in storm potential, and that applies for the entire Atlantic seaboard as well as the Great Lakes into parts of the plains. That purple color again increases in thunderstorm potential. Now, the impacts of climate change are not ubiquitous across the country. Look to the west out towards the Rockies. That brown color actually shows you a decrease in thunderstorm potential. So again, the eastern half of the United States seeing more storm potential, the western half seeing a little bit less. That's caused a bit of a shift in the traditional tornado alley and also a shift in where we are seeing severe weather. For us here at home in Ohio and Michigan, as well as much of the eastern U.S., there is an increase in thunderstorm activity and also severe weather. For folks out west, including portions of traditional Tornado Alley, it's starting to decline ever so slightly. Nationwide, though, tornado outbreaks are growing larger, and the number of tornadoes that occur in these outbreaks is overall increasing. Now, there is some year-to-year variability in this, as you'll notice the big spikes and also the low lows on this map. However, the line that we've drawn there, that shows you the overall trend in tornado outbreaks, and this data goes all the way back to 1950, so about 73 years ago, and we are seeing an uptick in tornado outbreak size. And of course, there is still some year-to-year variation on this scale. However, in the 2010s and 2020s, seeing more tornadoes on average versus back in the 1950s when that number was a little bit less. Last but not least, the number of tornado outbreaks that occur is growing more across much of the Midwest region. And as I mentioned, that eastern United States, the epicenter for far more number of tornadoes. This data goes back to 1979, so looking back for the last half century or so, we are seeing more tornadoes and more tornado outbreaks from St. Louis down towards Atlanta. But out west, that blue color from Dallas and Houston, even up to portions of Iowa, shows you where tornadoes are becoming a little bit less common. Now, we are kind of on the fence between seeing more tornadic activity and a little bit less out towards the mid-Atlantic region. And overall, Toledo, it's been relatively unchanged, and there's so much year-to-year variation, it's hard to peg exactly one cause or say climate change is the #1 variable impacting this. But one thing's for sure, Illinois, Missouri, Indiana have seen an uptick in tornadic activity, and that was represented this week with those tornadoes that occurred across northern Illinois. Now, for folks out to the east of us in Pennsylvania, the number of tornadoes that have been reported is actually slightly declining. And one of the overall shifts due to climate change, a shift in traditional tornado alley. And this is something that the WTOL 11 weather team has even noticed over the last few years to decades. Illinois seeing more severe weather, Missouri seeing severe weather. Even though these states are not traditionally characterized as tornado alley, we're starting to see that severe weather creep more often into the Midwest, and also even the Hoosier state starting to see more tornadoes than they were about 50 years ago in the 1970s. And again, Toledo on the fence between seeing more and less. And there's so much year-to-year variation and so much that depends on individual storms that, again, climate change, not the only factor, but it certainly does play a role in the number of tornadoes that occur. But overall, the number of tornado outbreaks and the severity is on the rise across the country. Now, it looks like the weather pattern is going to stay awfully active through the remainder of July, so we could very well see more downpours. We talked about that in last week's Climate Friday newsletter, how heavy rain is becoming more prevalent due to those soaking downpours from moisture in the atmosphere. Also, thunderstorms certainly possible as we head towards the latter half of July. Be sure to subscribe for the Climate Friday newsletter, WTOL.com/email, and you can follow along John Birchfield on Facebook, John WTOL on Twitter. We got new Climate Friday content. We'll see you next Friday for the latest.